Hi, I'm David Wheeler, Executive Director of Conserve Wildlife Foundation, and I'm excited to speak to you and Cape May County Library tonight about living with Eastern coyotes. Coyotes are one of the most fascinating stories of any wildlife species here in New Jersey and across the country. But I wanted to start with a personal observation that I had a couple years ago. Prior to a couple years back, I had never seen a coyote in New Jersey, despite tremendous amounts of time out in the outdoors and nature all across the state. Never saw a coyote. I had seen them in the West a number of different times in Yellowstone and different Western states in traveling, but never here in New Jersey. And then a couple years ago, I was walking my dog in my suburban neighborhood in central New Jersey. We're not far from a couple heavily wooded, protected areas, but not right next door either. Um, so the last thing I would have ever expected as I walked my dog out late one night, getting home from work late, is we're walking along a wooded area, and my dog doesn't even notice, but suddenly a golden blondish coyote, similar to the ones in these photos, not the same animal. I, of course, was not able to get a photo, but a golden blonde coyote trots across the street, right, more or less right in front of us, no more than about 20 yards away, crosses the trail that we're heading down. My dog was busy sniffing something, uh, didn't even notice. The coyote crossed the trail and ambled up a wooded embankment behind some homes and was gone from view. The whole thing couldn't have taken more than 3-4 seconds tops. But the impact it made on me, it literally took my breath away. And only about 30 seconds later, did my dog suddenly lift her head up, you know, totally alert, as if the coyote, only at that point maybe did the coyote get to where the wind actually brought the scent to my dog. And it just and for me it really fit in with the sudden appearance in a very unexpected way and place, and secondly, the fact that it was able to basically get in and out without really being noticed. That my own dog, a healthy adult dog, didn't even notice until it was far too late to even start barking. And I felt in many ways for me that just captured the essence of the coyote, this mysterious, elusive creature that can live literally right amongst us, and we don't even know it's there. I haven't seen one since, and hadn't seen one in the years prior, living in the same area. So they're sighted, but they're not something you see all the time, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. So just some brief background about me. I'm the executive director of the nonprofit Conserve Wildlife Foundation. I also taught environmental communications at Rutgers for 8 years. And I wrote the 2011 book, Wild New Jersey: Nature Adventures in the Garden State, where I got to travel all around the state and explore a lot of our incredible nature areas and a lot of the dramatic wildlife species and experiences that you can find all around the state. But as I mentioned, hadn't seen a coyote at that point in the wild in New Jersey. The nonprofit Conserve Wildlife Foundation has worked for the last 20 plus years to protect rare wildlife and at-risk wildlife species all around the state and beyond, but most of our work takes place here in New Jersey. And we do that through field science, surveys, monitoring, habitat restoration. We also use quite a bit of volunteer engagement and of course education and working to inform the public on so many wildlife issues and engage them, so there's a greater stake in how we treat nature here in New Jersey moving forward. So the coyote, as I mentioned, is a very unique story. And here in New Jersey, when you think back to, well, what was the landscape like during the colonial times, which in many ways is more or less the start of when we say, well, what was the ecosystem like? What was it like here? Uh, you know, Not in prehistoric times necessarily, but what was it like when it first started to be settled by European settlers? And if you see here, there was no coyote photo. There's no coyote painting here because there was no coyotes here in the Northeast. Instead, the top of our food chains here in the Northeast were all about gray wolves and mountain lions and black bears, as well as a number of other mid-sized predators as well, but they were the top of the food chain. Coyotes, in contrast, were found. You see the dark black outline here. That's where coyotes were found for the most part in during that time, during the 17 and 1800s. Um, their range was mostly focused on the prairies and grasslands and mountainous regions and deserts in kind of that the central west, as well as into Mexico and into along the coast as well, the Pacific coast. But that was pretty much it. It was more or less they were a much more open rangeland type of creature, as opposed to in the dense forests of the Northeast, where the competition, frankly, was a bit too much for them at the time. Uh, as I mentioned, being found out there in the West, one of their earlier nicknames was the Prairie Wolf, and it certainly lived up to that. They were very common, found all around the West, and explorers, uh, including Lewis and Clark, as they started to find this unique wolf species, as they described it. They soon realized it was a separate species, much smaller than the wolf, and with very different habitats and habits as well. Yet going back even further, the way the coyote was viewed was something altogether more grand and magnificent. For many Native American tribes, the coyote was kind of the signature deity, in many ways the original American totem for many of these Native American tribes. The coyote, interestingly enough, wasn't viewed in this kind of omnipotent, all powerful and all seeing and all knowledgeable way, like some deities might have been, but rather the coyote was very much a stand-in for humans and for human nature. And so in these remarkable tales, the coyote would often take on not just human behaviors in kind of the ancient myths, but would actually act in many ways the way humans would. Uh, Overconfident, clever, but maybe too clever, getting itself into trouble, and then being humbled. And the reactions, the psychological, reactions and thoughts that were attributed to the coyote during these myths and tales really spoke volumes about how many of the Native American tribes saw the coyote more as a brother, and as a really someone, a creature that can give great insights into our own nature, as opposed to just something out there and separate. So very remarkable and a unique role for the coyote in Native American mythology. And then our own American bard of the West and the expansion of the U.S., Mark Twain, about as American an author and spokesman as we could imagine, had a very different view of the coyote. Here's just some of the. I mean, I had to just pick these excerpts from a much longer diatribe. But anytime you're describing something as sick and sorry looking skeleton, the meanest creatures despise him, even the fleas would desert him. So spiritless and cowardly that even while his exposed teeth are pretending a threat, the rest of his face is apologizing for it. And he is so homely. So Mark Twain, tell us how you really feel about the coyote, please. And Twain, as much as this is in many ways written in Twain's signature fashion of exaggerating for comic relief, and also to kind of give his own views in a playful way, it actually ended up really sinking in. It was written at a time and during a time of westward expansion that really sunk into the way the public and decision makers viewed the coyote, which at that point, the coyote had more or less flown under the radar in terms of being a target for the widespread extermination of predators we had in the country at the time. Most of those efforts were focused on the wolves, focused on mountain lions, focused on what were perceived as larger threats than the coyote had been to to people at the time, viewed that way. But Twain, really changed that quite a bit. And luckily, we have scientists who can put that into perspective. And so, Scientific American uh, gave their own scientific, highly scientific perspective in 1920, calling the coyote the original Bolshevik, which mind blowing to think that this was the Scientific American approach to categorizing one of our native species. You know, I could only imagine today National Geographic using some kind of similar pejorative to describe one of our native species today. Um, but this captured this transformation from the coyote to being this kind of, you know, prairie wolf, this clever prairie wolf that was interesting to observe for many of the early explorers, and certainly for the Native Americans much more than that, into becoming what was fast progressing into becoming our greatest enemy in the West. And it was a quick transition, and it was a deadly transition. Um, Soon enough, after the Mark Twain and the scientists at the time, in the public eye, had their say in the matter, um, the coyote found itself number one on our most wanted lists. You had ranchers who blamed them for any of their livestock deaths. You had hunters who blamed coyotes for wiping out too many of the deer and elk that the hunters were depending on. You had families and settlers blaming coyotes for the threats to their pets and their children. So the coyote really became public enemy number one quickly. And what that resulted in was a devastating, no holds barred campaign of extermination against the coyote, against many species in the West, but the coyote bore the brunt of it as wolves were knocked out, and mountain lions and other predators were reduced to such small numbers. Coyotes were there for the taking, uh, and that's exactly what the authorities did. During a 9-year period in the late 40s into the mid 50s, over 6.5 million coyotes were slaughtered in the West. And this wasn't hunting. And our group works with hunters and sportsmen, and who have been a big part of preserving so much of New Jersey and our great outdoors. This wasn't that. This was something altogether different. This was a mass poisoning extermination. Things like strychnine and cyanide bombs, where the coyote would go to eat a food that was left there as a bait, and basically blow up in this cloud of cyanide gas. Absolutely devastating, and it obviously did incredible damage, killed so many coyotes, millions of coyotes, but also did just widespread ecosystem damage and hurt so many other species beyond the coyote. Some of the poisons that were used really got into the ecosystems and just really worked their way up the food chain. And then it was only years later that ultimately President Nixon banned the use of poisoning on public lands in the late 60s and early 70s. And so it took that time. It took a few decades of this before the federal, in this case, the president, instructed federal agencies to scale back. And to put that into perspective, I mentioned the Twain and Scientific American quotes, but soon enough, after this extermination campaign had started, the scientific studies were finally done. So they started the campaign before even knowing what coyotes were really eating. But then within a decade or so, scientists did study what coyotes were eating. They found out it was nothing at all like the myths. The livestock kills did happen, but they were a small part of the coyote diet, and the impact they made was minuscule compared to what they were being blamed for in the popular press. And so as a result, you would think, well, then they maybe adjusted, but they didn't. They just continued with the campaign exactly as is, and only until the late 60s and early 70s. What's crazy about this, and speaks to the coyote's resilience, is that it had the opposite effect of what it was intended to do. Um, Instead of wiping out the coyotes from the West, um, instead, what it did was give the coyotes a much bigger boost. Uh, Coyotes, because of their howls and their yips and all their communications verbally um, to other coyotes, when they howl at night, they're waiting to hear what's the response like, what's the population like out there. Between that and the perceived pressure that their population's under, their litters can expand from say 3 to 5 pups up to 12 to 15 pups. So you're talking magnitudes higher potentially in given litters. And so as they're putting all this pressure on the coyotes at the time, the coyote populations, while they're losing millions, they're actually growing because they're having much bigger litters and just growing like wildfire. One aside that's sad to say, but even though obviously a lot of the worst of the damage was scaled down, they continue to be killed today rather indiscriminately. Ultimately, around 500,000 coyotes are killed a year between hunting and trapping, road mortality. But a part of that is also 80,000 a year are killed by the federal agency Wildlife Services, which is a descendant of the original agency that did that kind of widespread extermination campaign in the 40s and 50s. And so at taxpayer money, basically, we're funding 80,000 coyotes and countless other native species to be killed for agriculture purposes. So it's an issue that's been scaled down a bit, but it's far from gone, unfortunately. But anyway, let's move forward. So the popular image of the coyote changed dramatically through the cartoon, and Wile E. Coyote and his his very persistent pursuit of the Roadrunner um, gave a totally different view of Coyote. And even though he was technically the villain in this, it was a villain we could all relate to in his efforts to, like Don Quixote, just continue chasing something that he never quite could get his hands on. And so suddenly, in the 60s in particular, the coyote had started to get a much different much more sympathetic public presence here in the U.S. Now, of course, we see coyotes, everything from movies like Coyote Ugly to sports team names and mascots for the Phoenix Coyotes and the San Antonio Spurs. Of course, it's used in different slang terms having to do with immigration at the border, TV shows using the term. And so you have basically, it's become what I would say is a mixed bag, which, some positive, some negative, at least in terms of perception. And for the coyote, that's a huge step up from being literally the arch villain of the time, which is how it was described in the 1950s. So we had the coyote population exploding as it was being under dramatic attack in the West. So coyotes had to go somewhere. And they started to go east. They started to go north and east. And so that dark gray, which was kind of their original footprint, they spread not only west in greater numbers to the coast. They had been there, but in much smaller numbers prior. And for our purposes, especially important, they came to the east. And so you had one group that went south and east, and you had some intermixing with the rare red wolf. But the ones that we have here in New Jersey were particularly impacted by those that went north and east. And they bred with the gray wolf up in Canada and some of the northern parts of the US before then spreading around the East Coast. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. But you could see each decade they moved further and further. So by the 20s, they were in Ohio, and then within a decade into Pennsylvania and upstate New York, and then into New England. And, little by little, they basically spread their way. Here, to give you an example of, when I say they intermixed with the different wolf species to basically then colonize the whole East Coast, you can see the size difference. If you look on the far left, the Western coyote is really tiny compared to most of the other wolves, and the the coyote, or Coywolf, as some refer to it, the Eastern Coyote is really a hybrid. It's kind of a much greater size than the Western Coyote. It's about 50% bigger on average, but yet not wolf size. So it really is in many ways a different creature than the Western Coyote. Here you can see, for your perspective, as you're picturing, well, what does this kind of measure up to? Something we're a little more familiar with. You picture a German Shepherd. A German Shepherd is a little bigger than an Eastern Coyote, quite a bit bigger heft, size-wise and weight-wise, but a smaller. I'm sorry, a little bigger in terms of height and visible size. So much bulkier. In contrast, the Western Coyote much smaller than the Eastern, as you can see. Eastern Coyote, a good way to describe it in general, is as a medium-sized dog in terms of its size. Also, and we'll talk more about this later, but a couple quick identification notes. The coyote versus the red fox. Coyote is significantly bigger. You see on the upper right there. The foxes are very small compared to coyotes, who are in turn are much smaller than a gray wolf. That's an Eastern Coyote image on the top right or on the left. And you see the red fox is not only much smaller, but red foxes tend to have a white tip on their tail. Coyotes tend to have dark tips on their tail. Coyotes also are one of their signature ways to identify them is their tail is typically tucked below their legs. It's down and tucked in between their legs. Red fox tend to keep those tails out and more prominently visible. And red fox's tails are much longer compared to their body than coyotes, which are, not even half the length of their overall bodies. Red foxes are close to their full body length in the tail. So the number of ways to identify them. And so the Eastern Coyote, as I mentioned, really in many ways a different species, even a different kind of species than the Western Coyote. The males 30 to 45 pounds, females slightly smaller than that. Not dramatic difference compared to some other of our native species. Around 3 to 4.5 feet long and around 2 feet high. So yeah, really a medium dog if you picture that. Their lifespan is very interesting because in captivity, coyotes can live to be 12 to 15 years old, similar to many dog breeds rather. But in the wild, in kind of the rural wild, what we would say, let's say they're kind of more typical habitat out west. Coyotes really only live to be around 2 or 3 because just the pressures of living in the wild are great. In general, coyotes, it's maybe for those coyotes, it's probably a 60% odds that they'll get through their first year. And if they do, that's probably only, they probably only live another year or 2 from there. Now, contrast that with many of the coyotes living closer to cities and suburbs. Those coyotes live closer to the age in captivity that we would expect. So those coyotes might live more around 10 to 12 years old. And so, and that's a big function of, they're not having to worry about hunting and trapping. And in many ways, there's a lot of their food sources are, if in some ways easier to find, or at least more reliable, as opposed to in the wild where they probably have to cover a bigger range, and there's the competition is simply different than they would get in suburbs and cities. So it's a dramatic difference in terms of those coyotes who live maybe closer to our communities, or travel between our communities, versus those who live truly out in the wild, miles from anywhere. Another interesting part about the behavior of coyotes that we see here in the East is that if you think of the typical Western coyote, we picture that one out by a campfire somewhere, howling on its lonesome, and that lone coyote, right, trying to see, is there any other coyotes out there? That's kind of our standard picture in many ways. But the Eastern coyotes, they form loose packs, as well as they can be found solitary, but also in loose packs. Those loose packs tend to be really just extended family units. So you have your alpha pair, you maybe have the young of the year, no longer puppies, but in that transition age, and maybe one or two transient coyotes with them. So we're not talking massive uh, pack sizes, but we're talking enough that it's a group, and they have a bond, and kind of can share that, share the benefits of having a pack when they need it. So occasionally you'll hear stories in the East. In New England, I remember one of the eye-opening stories early in the coyotes' colonization of the East was a group of coyotes chasing a deer out onto ice on a lake, and basically working as a pack. And that was a real eye opener. As At the time, the genetics hadn't really come in to understand that there was truly, a hybrid of wolf, as well as coyote, and that behavior really, was something different than the researchers were expecting at the time. That being said, coyotes do still operate in solitary ways much of the time. So they estimate it's around half to a third of the time that they'll be part of a pack as opposed to more solitary. And lastly, of course, they have tremendously strong senses of smell and sight and hearing. And so, more than anything, they're just very alert and always on. Picture your dog when the mailman comes up. That dog might hear the mailman, long before you do. And the coyote is that times, many times stronger, and just in terms of alertness and awareness. So coyotes only den during the time that they have pups. So the rest of the year they don't use a den, and they look for areas during that time when they're about to raise pups. They will look for anything from the stumps of trees to hollowed out areas where a tree has fallen, to under rock piles, to red fox dens that they make their own, or other animal burrows that they can kind of make their own. They typically like to face the southerly direction. They like to have something that can be well drained, and protected as much as possible, and well camouflaged. So they have very specific things that they look for. They also aren't just committed to that den. At any point, they may move the den with the pups and go find another one. So the mom and dad coyote tend to be monogamous. They mate typically in January, February. They give birth after a couple months, usually in March or April. Like I said, around 4 to 6 cubs that they'll have. Those cubs will stay in the den with mom during that first month to 2 months. They'll stay in there all the time, and dad will go out and bring food home. So dad brings the food home. The mom does all the work in the den during those times. The mom actually is also the one who chooses the den location and picks that out. And then after around say a month and a half, 2 months, typically the pups start to wean themselves off, depending solely on mom. They start to explore a little bit on their own or with one of their siblings, and usually by late fall, they're dispersing fully, and in many cases dispersing fully. In other cases, maybe they still stay somewhat connected to their kind of familial unit. But for the most part, they disperse, and they could be anywhere from typically 30 to 50 miles, but as far away as 100 miles as they look to find their own range. In terms of prey too, I think one of the common conceptions of coyotes is that well, they're meat eaters, right? They're like wolves. They're um, it's just, of course, they're carnivores, but the reality is they're opportunistic. They're generalists. They're omnivores, and it reflects the fact that even habitat wise, they can be found in such a wide range of habitats. Forests and fields. They especially like those edges where they can maybe have either as options. Um, Obviously, in other parts of the country, you can find deserts and mountains. as part of their habitats. But here in New Jersey, typically they look for those kind of combination areas where you have maybe agricultural fields, farmland fields that are in use for part of the year, forested corridors alongside where they can travel safely. And they'll use the edges of suburbs and cities as well. Again, wherever they can travel safely. Um, as I mentioned with the prey, it's very varied. So their overall their biggest prey is small rodents. Mice, voles, moles. Small rodents make up the largest part of their prey, but absolutely they'll catch anything from those insects, as small as insects, up to deer. So it's a very wide range, and it follows by season. In the summer, they'll feast on the berries that are kind of perfect at that season. They also feast on the insects which are at their peaks. By fall, they're adding more of the small rodents and rabbits and frogs. By winter, deer tend to be more available to them. Uh, Things like the snow and maybe poor foraging and health for some of the older or sicker deer make them more available. Coyotes in general, um, they can attack healthy adult deer. It's not one of their primary. It's not really something they depend on regularly. More typically, they'll attack old and sick deer or fawns. So by late spring, when many fawns are hiding and sitting still in the forest while mom is out, kind of looking for food and kind of figuring out next steps for the deer. Um, those fawns are incredibly vulnerable because they just sit still. Their whole defense is to just sit motionless. And so for a coyote, it's a ideal meal in late spring. And so we mentioned the coyotes spreading east and kind of colonizing the Eastern Seaboard. Well, New Jersey was a big part of that. So New Jersey, around the same time, we lost wolves in the 1800s. Um, Soon after that, we were at our low point around 1900 in terms of so much of our forest had been cleared. Farmland and towns had cleared a huge portion of the state. But then it started coming back. A lot of our forests started growing back as farmland and agriculture decreased over the 1900s in New Jersey. A lot of that forest grew back. You had our development pressures continued all around the state in many places, but our forests reached numbers that were far many times higher in terms of proportion of our state than they were in the early 1900s, and it remains today. Around 40% of our state is forested to varying degrees. In some cases, it's a deep, healthy forest, and in other cases, much more of a superficial, very damaged forest, particularly as you get closer within the higher developed areas. Nonetheless, though, it's a landscape that is ready-made for coyotes. And so the coyote, you can see here, the coyote expansion, each decade they made new inroads, and it was a true steady colonization. So by the early 60s, they were established. And interestingly enough, the first report of a coyote in New Jersey was a person in Cape May County who donated a coyote to the Philadelphia Zoo in the 1930s. They believe that was a coyote brought back from the West. They probably got a pup somewhere and brought back, and then realized as the pup was growing old, hey, I can't take care of this. What is actually a wild animal, and not just a little friendly dog. And they donated to the Philadelphia Zoo. But at that point, there hadn't been any wild documented sightings. 1939 in Lambertville, there was an unverified sighting that they believe was a coyote, but the very first documented one was in the 1940s in Lower Township in Cape May. That was New Jersey's very first documented coyote. And from there, you had sporadic sightings over the next few decades. And then you had this, where right now, approximately 470 of our municipalities in New Jersey, it's amazing that we have that many in the first place. We have over 500. But roughly, municipalities covering about 96% of our land area have had coyote sightings. And you see to the right there, there's the frequency, as opposed to just that there's been a sighting. That gives you an idea of how common they tend to be sighted. Obviously, more rural or at least edge type areas have the highest frequency, even though they've been found everywhere. In Cape May County, Morris River Township has been by far the highest number of sightings, with over 100 sightings as of a few years ago, and that could have increased again since then. But for the most part, Cape May County gets around 10 to 20 sightings a year countywide that are reported. So they're out there, but they're not very visible, as we'll talk about later. They're very elusive. Just a quick aside, it's not just in New Jersey, but New York City and Philadelphia have had some very high-profile visitors. The coyotes who made it to Central Park a few times in the past decade were local celebrities, and it's pretty remarkable to think in these major metropolises that you can have an animal like a coyote making its inroad and surviving there for a while, as it did in Central Park. And so Cape May, as I mentioned, you have steady numbers. It doesn't compare in terms of likelihood of seeing coyotes as the counties in the northwest part of the state have the most sightings statewide, but Cape May does have its share. And it's interesting too, because coyotes, despite their reputation for much of the 1900s as such an enemy to people, it turns out they actually offer quite a number of positives. Excuse me. Coyotes offer us some benefits, such as rodent control. They keep rodent populations in check. They as I mentioned, while deer aren't a huge part of their diet, deer maybe are up to between 10 and 20% of their diet, depending on time of year. So they by themselves, they don't control deer or Canada geese for that matter, but every ally we have in those areas help. And same thing with roadkill. That can be a great meal for a coyote, a deer. One of the many deer that are hit and pose great safety risks to us as drivers, and not to mention the damage they do to our gardens and ecologically, how they've decimated our forests. So coyotes are a true ally in that way. Interestingly enough, coyotes also benefit us by putting a check on kind of mid-sized predators, and thinking of things like raccoons, foxes, and feral cats. These groups of species, without coyotes present, their numbers tend to skyrocket. With coyotes present, they tend to seek out other areas because they'd rather not be in the same range as an active coyote. And what that means is ecologically, that's huge, because those mid-sized predators can wreak havoc on songbirds, on shorebirds, on some of our other smaller species that otherwise can be wiped out in areas by those mid-sized predators booming too much population-wise. So coyotes serve a role within the food web too, of kind of keeping things in check. Like many animals during this past year, more sightings than ever were had of coyotes, and we've seen that across the board. And it's still an open question. Well, how much has it been, especially during the peak periods of quarantine? It was more likely than anything, it was by people being removed from the landscape, coyotes felt freer. to go travel around. Roads that had been maybe dotted with cars zooming by at 50 miles an hour previously were now wide open for stretches of time. And they might have 20 minutes to amble along a highway with no cars passing them during that quarantine time that they didn't otherwise. So it was really a time where not just then, but since then, it's still been a lot of reduced traffic that has benefited coyotes. Um, and at the same time, uh, we have more people at home working from home or just being home and maybe looking out windows, being able to, in the past, a coyote might have trotted through a backyard and totally unobserved. And now maybe someone's working from home and looking out the window and has that coyote sighting. So it will be interesting over the course of this year as we continue to get data, how much sightings have increased. Um, but to put it into perspective, coyotes are uh, not one of our most reported animals, despite being in every county. The calls that the state gets about concerned calls about animals, reports or concerns, particularly black bears are number one by far, and then you get raccoons, you get deer, woodchuck, beavers, a number of other species before you get coyote. So coyote, there's always, of course, concern in certain areas when they're seen. A lot of misconceptions as well. We're going to talk about that. But the reality is because they're so seldom seen, even in areas they are, they're just simply not reported as much. Unfortunately for coyotes, as I mentioned, during those times during more normal times, non-COVID times, they are very likely to be hit by cars, relatively speaking. In certain areas, car incidents can make up almost half of coyote deaths. We have in New Jersey, we have hunting and trapping that in certain areas will make up the bulk of coyote deaths, but car accidents, especially as you get closer to suburbs and cities, car accidents or car impacts, I should say, are the number one cause for most coyote mortalities in many of the parts of the state. And that's one of the places that one of the reasons that this new state initiative connecting habitat across New Jersey or change, it's been launched in the last 3 years. And our group, Conserve Wildlife Foundation, works with the state Division of Fish and Wildlife and other groups to promote this. It's a voluntary program where we seek to get landowners to voluntarily, try to protect land that can serve as corridors. The old vision was, well, you protect this here and that there, and these kind of national park type settings will protect the wildlife. And in reality, it doesn't work like that, because they need to connect. They need to have that genetic flow between different populations. So wildlife corridors, it's become more and more important, more and more well known that we need to protect different corridors for wildlife populations to interact and to exchange between the two areas, multiple areas. So coyotes are a real signature species of this, along with, of course, black bears, quails, wood turtles, northern pine snakes. The list goes on and on. But that's just one of many areas where we simply have to learn better how to coexist with coyotes. As I've said, they spread all around the state. They're in almost every town, either in or have been. They do move a lot, so if you had one pass through last year, it by no means means they're still there. But because they're so elusive, you don't know for sure. And so there's really a number of common sense, observations I'd like to get across today, particularly whether you yourself or just spreading the word, others who may not be as informed in terms of what that means. If you see a coyote, so for starters, a coyote sighting in and of itself is nothing to be alarmed at. If you're driving home one evening from work or from wherever, and you're driving along a wooded area and you see a coyote trotting along the edge of the road and heads off into the woods, that's natural behavior, absolutely natural behavior. you know, even along the edges of your neighborhood, you see a coyote one time trotting along. That's nothing to be alarmed at. Um, if you're seeing a coyote regularly in the same place, that means there's something attracting the coyote there. That means it's becoming habituated in some way. Maybe someone's leaving out pet food. Maybe there's some kind of other food source. Garbage isn't secured. Um, Most coyotes, garbage is a tiny percentage of what they eat or what they raid, like 1%. But that's most. And so the reality is, an individual coyote, if it gets habituated in a certain area, then that is a problem. That is a concern, you know, for safety, both people's safety living nearby and for the coyote itself. So the last thing we want to do is feed the coyotes directly, of course, or leave out sources. If you're in an area where you know you've had coyotes, uh, try to don't leave your pet food out overnight. That's an attractant to the coyote. Watch your pets carefully, or kids, your young kids, if you know it's a coyote active area. You know, these are things that we make sure you secure your garbage. You want to just make sure that you're not, you know, doing anything to attract that coyote. So it's either, if you're seeing it regularly, it's either habituated, or of most concern, if it's acting without fear of you or people, then that's a problem. Coyotes, by their very nature, are very wary, very cautious, and absolutely, you know, terrified of us. That's the reason we don't see them regularly, even when they're living in different towns nearby. And so there are occasional, very occasional, but it can happen, where there's been coyote attacks. We've had around 4 different groups of attacks in the last, say, 15 years, in different parts of New Jersey. Um, each one where a coyote attacked 1 or 2 people. Fortunately, none of them were. Usually, in almost every case, it was a bite, and then they fought the coyote off or scared the coyote off. In a couple of the cases, the coyote had rabies, or was otherwise habituated. But these are extremely rare. And you know, I can't put a finer point on just how rare coyotes attacks are, not just in New Jersey but across the country, considering how common they are. So they really stay away from people to the greatest extent possible. Now, that being said, you want to exercise caution. And so with coyotes, or with any wild animal, you want to maintain your distance. You don't want to get so close. A good way to look at it is, if you're getting so close that they're responding to your presence, and doing something other than just running away, then that means, you know, you want to keep more of a distance. With coyotes, though, you want to, as long as it's not showing signs of already attacking you, if it doesn't run away when it first sees you, you want to make some noise. You want to bang really loudly, shout loudly. Um, Whatever you do, don't run. With any predator, you want to run and trigger the pursuit. Um, but 99 times out of 100, that will scare the predator away by making noise and showing yourself you're not afraid of the coyote. And then that clicks into the coyote. Oh yeah, I don't want anything to do with people. People mean bad news for me. Um, and if any of those things, if that doesn't work, and the coyote's still lingering around, it means it probably is sick in some way, and absolutely a concern. And so in cases like that, you want to call 1-877-WARN DEP, as in Department of Environmental Protection. WARN as in warning. So 1-877-WARN DEP. And that's a number you call if there's ever any kind of environmental emergency. But for our purposes, if whether it's a coyote or a bear or anything else, it's not a sighting that would be the threat that you would call, but it's this kind of behavior that is not typical behavior, and behavior that could lead to something more dangerous. That's the ideal time to absolutely make that call. So on a more positive note, let's say you're somebody who enjoys hiking, or you're out in nature areas, and you want to know, well, what is this I'm seeing, these tracks? It could be a coyote. Coyote and dog tracks are similar, dogs of similar size. Um, in general, for me, I've noticed the dog tracks tend to be a little wider and heavier. So even if they're the same size, the dog tracks tend to be a little wider and heavier. Coyote tracks are a little more narrow. It kind of fits in with their whole bearing, their narrow snout, um, their thin frame. Their tracks follow suit. That's one way to remember it. As always, with any dogs versus, for instance, a bobcat, the dogs, you see the claw marks. The cats, of course, have retractable claws, so you don't see them. Um, but really, the tracks are one way. The best way for identifying coyote, other than seeing them in person, is, of course, everyone's favorite slide, the scat slide. But the coyote scat tends to be long and tends to have hair of, whether it's deer or small rodents, mixed in, and it's pretty unique and obvious. I mean, there of course can be overlap with dogs, as are in many ways with coyotes, but at the same time, it really is kind of a signature look. And so, if you're not sure, take a picture, and then you can look online for good examples, and see if you think you might have seen coyote scat. And of course, I got to leave you with this adorable picture of these coyote pups. Um, because nothing reminds you that, oh yeah, they're related in so many ways to that dog in my living room that is such a big part of our family. And coyotes are. I want to remind you of that, but I also want to, of course, reinforce that they are wild animals, and so as adorable as they are, we don't want to get near them and pet them, anything like that. We want to keep our distance, enjoy the moment, enjoy the sighting, but make sure we keep it safe. And we don't want to put either the coyote or anybody at risk. And so with that, I want to just end it with letting you know some ways that, if you're interested in these topics, some ways that you can help wildlife. Of course, advocating and voting, things like that, are incredibly important. Advocating for stronger wildlife conservation laws or regulations on everything from pollinators to protecting nature areas. Volunteering, of course, once COVID runs its course and we all feel more safely getting out there and volunteering in groups, that, of course, getting those hands-on experiences is irreplaceable. There's nothing I would recommend more than those kind of volunteering opportunities, whether it's with Conserve Wildlife Foundation or so many other groups doing great work. Um, Volunteering is something I highly encourage. In the meantime, there are some volunteering experiences, but of course, a lot of these have been scaled back because of COVID safety restrictions. One of the other biggest things I can recommend is planting native. Native plants go so far for pollinators, for the birds that depend on pollinators, for all of us who depend on pollinators, and really for the whole food web. So when you plant native, it just has these positive impacts that go in a million directions. So that's about as important as you can do, whether it's in your yard, at your workplace, in your community center, at your church. It goes a long way. Also, putting up things like bird feeders and bird boxes, bat boxes, all of those help quite a bit. And of course, contributing. Nonprofits like Conserve Wildlife Foundation depend on donations, so any bit you can give is also a huge help. I invite you to check out our website, conservewildlifenj.org. We have free wildlife webcams for bald eagles and peregrine falcons and ospreys. And we have very detailed field guides for almost all of our imperiled species here in New Jersey, over 90 species. So they're great resources. And again, it's all free. I invite you to check it out. And I thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm really excited to talk about coyotes with you, and I hope you enjoyed this and learned a lot. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly via my email, david.wheeler@conservewildlifenj.org, just like the domain you see online. And for that, I thank you, and I thank Cape May County Library. Have a great night.